Hey there, y'all. Peter Barclay here, host of what we're about to jump into, the Hangout Sessions podcast. And we are back with another scintillating episode. And tonight, we are looking at finishing up our series that we were doing on love. Now, we've been through a whole heap of stuff on this topic, starting out with on love. We did the more excellent way because love is a more excellent way than any other way because God is love. We talked about that. We talked about the attributes of love, and we talked about patience, and there's many other things that we could still choose to cover. But we did part 1 of the end of the series last week, and that part was the attributes of selfishness, because as always, there are two sides to every coin, and to know truly what love is, you also need to know what selfishness looks like, so that you can recognize it both in yourself or when people are being selfish and not truly loving you. So, today we are wrapping up our series on love, and we are going to do that with part 2 of Charles Finney's Attributes of Selfishness. So, as always, I hope you have your cup. I clearly have mine. Grab your Bibles, your pens, your pencils, highlighters, whatever it is, comfy blanket, strap yourself in, and for the next, hour and a half, we'll see how we get through this here. And we are going to go through the attributes of selfishness. So, just before we jump too deep into it, ask yourself, what kinds of things do you think of when you think of selfishness? When do you recognize it in yourself? When do you recognize it in people around you? Where does it come from? What are the roots of it? Because in the next part, so we're going to do part 1, which is really part 11 because we're picking up from where we left off. And so the next part 2 or part 12, we're going to talk and start getting into the roots and the origins of where selfishness comes from. So to begin with, part 11, or the first part for tonight, the first attribute of selfishness we're going to look at is falsehood or lying. And that is definitely, and for most people clearly, an attribute of selfishness. Falsehood may be objective or subjective. Objective falsehood is that which stands opposed to truth. So meaning when you talk objective, it's objecting is the root word. Subjective falsehood is a heart conformed to error to objective falsehood. Subjective falsehood is a state of mind, and it's an attribute of selfishness. So a theology or something similar to that. It is the will in the attitude of resisting truth and embracing error and lies. This is always and necessarily an attribute of selfishness. Selfishness consists in the choice of an end, which is a goal, as we've been saying all along with Finney's sermons. So a goal that is opposed to all truth and cannot but proceed to the realization of that goal in conformity with error or falsehood instead of conforming to truth. If at any time it seizes upon objective truth, as it often does, it is with a false intention. So if someone is telling the truth or any of that kind of stuff, it is with an ulterior motive. It is with an intention at war with the truth, the nature and the relations of things. If any sinner at any time and under any circumstances tells the truth, it is for a selfish reason. It is to compass a false end. So even if they're telling the truth, they have a sneaky reason for why they want to tell that truth. Maybe they want to get someone in trouble. Maybe they want to get out of trouble or shift blame or deflect attention to someone. So there's always a reason why people in the world who don't have God will tell the truth in a matter. It's a form of witchcraft. It's a form of gaslighting, even to tell the truth for this type of person. This person has a lie in his heart and a lie in his right hand. He stands upon falsehood. He lives for it. He lives for it, and he does not uniformly and openly falsify the truth. It is because objective truth is consistent with subjective falsehood. His heart is false as it can be. It has embraced and sold itself to the greatest lie in the universe. The selfish man has practically proclaimed that his good is the supreme good. Nay, that there is no other good but his own. That there are no other rights but his own rights. That all are bound to serve him, and that all interests are to yield to his. Now all this, as I said, is the greatest falsehood that ever was or can be. Yet this is the solemn practical declaration of every sinner. His choice affirms that God has no rights, that he ought not to be loved and obeyed, and that he has no right to govern the universe, but that God and all beings ought to obey and serve the sinner. Can there be a greater, a more shameless falsehood than this? And shall such a one pretend to regard the truth? No, verily. The very pretense is only an instance and an illustration of the truth that falsehood is an essential element of his character. If every sinner on earth does not openly and at all times falsify the truth, it is not because of the truthfulness of his heart, but for some purely selfish reason. This must be: his heart is utterly false, and it is impossible that, remaining a sinner, he should have any true regard to the truth. He is a liar, and this is an essential and an eternal attribute of his character. Now, the things we just read and just mentioned, where everyone must bow down, including God, to the person in question. Now, some of you may recognize this because it is inherently the traits of a narcissistic person. Now, people without God who twist and pervert the truth to suit their own needs and who put themselves in the place of God, that's a purely narcissistic trait. And the thing about it is that every person who does not know God falls into this category to some degree and stage. So the truth is, these people may speak bits of truth sprinkled with a whole bunch of lies, just so that it makes the lies seem more true. It's also a form of witchcraft. You're telling stories, basically, for a purpose. To get someone to like you, to get your own way, to coerce them into doing the things that you want to do. There's all manner of reason why people fudge the truth. It's where a game like Broken Telephone comes from, because the first person at the beginning will speak a truth. But by the time it gets to the person at the end, it's a completely different story that is very far removed from the truth. Why is that? Well, it's just the way the human brain works. And so when you look at it, a person who does not know the Lord, this is essential, and it's an attribute of their character that they couldn't escape even if they wanted to. The only way to escape this type of character is through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and Him crucified, the shedding of His blood. And you have to admit that. You have to surrender to that. And so that's what he's talking about here, is that no matter what happens, and even people who have surrendered their life to Christ can at times fall into this type of character because they haven't fully given every part of themselves over to the Lord. And that's not a condemnation to anyone who may be listening. That's an encouragement to open yourself up more to the Lord and allow Him to change you even still. So this is the thing, is that one of my favorite sayings, and a very good friend of mine said it first, but for the grace of God, there go I. Meaning, if it wasn't for God's work in my life, if it wasn't for God's grace, all these selfish attributes would fully be a part of me. I know before I knew the Lord, they most definitely were. Even afterward, they're not fully gone yet. God is still working on them. And that goes for you and for anyone else that you know. So it is true that his intellect, so his thought processes, they condemn falsehood and justify truth, that oftentimes through the intellect, a deep impression is or may be made on the sensibility in favor of the truth. So, meaning your conscience will tell you that you're doing the wrong thing. But if the heart is unchanged, it holds on to the lies and the perverseness in the practical proclamation of the greatest lies in the universe, to wit, that God ought not to be trusted and that Christ is not worthy of confidence. These are lies from the devil, as we can clearly see. That one's own interest is the supreme good, and that all interests ought to be accounted of less value than one's own. Alright, so that's falsehood and lying. Clearly an attribute of selfishness. Now here's the real trickster, and the one that really we have to talk about a lot, and make sure that we have a clear understanding of this particular attribute of selfishness, because it's like a company under the umbrella of a parent company. And this particular attribute of love is kind of the parent company of all the other attributes. Now, I know a bit later on, Finney will say slightly different from that there is one other bit that's maybe above this. But this is the sneakiest thing, because if you're honest with yourself and you look at someone, and I've had people in my life And I try and bring this up as delicately as possible in case any of you have someone in your life that has done this. And I know it can be a tough one to admit to, because I've been there. But someone who has committed suicide, who you would think depression and anxiety and whatever led them, the hurt, the pain, the roots of those hurts and those pains is actually pride. Which is why someone who resorts to suicide is very, very super dangerous, as per the word of God, to their soul. And so you can be a victim and be prideful. You can think that you're behaving in a humble manner, but you take pride in your humility. And therefore, it's no longer humility. So there's a lot of different ways that pride is sneaky. So we really need to understand this, which is why I'm very glad that Finney includes this in his attributes. So pride is a disposition to exalt oneself above others and to get out of one's proper place in the scale of being, and to climb up over the heads of our equals, or even people who are superior to us. Now, the reason that, just quickly going back to what I was saying there about even victims being in pride, and this is something I've mentioned on other podcasts, is that depression, anxiety, and a lot of these things, the reason that pride is selfish and why those behaviors are selfish is simply because depression, anxiety, and a lot of the hurts that we feel are based on disappointed expectations of others. We expect people to behave a certain way towards us. And that's what it means by getting out of place, where you think you are, and most people would never admit this, but those disappointed expectations are because we thought we were better than someone and that they need to act a certain way towards us. Then we get disappointed and call that depression. And yes, some of those things happen over and over and over again repeatedly, but that just means that you're out of alignment. You're out of place with where we all are. We're all on a journey. We're all going there. If we actually stopped and worked together instead of trying to get our own way, it would be a lot easier for us to get there. So, we're going to start talking about pride as injustice as well. And another thing that we have to understand is that God demands justice. He is a just God. And so pride is injustice. It's treating people in a way that they ought not to be treated. And that's why God goes so hard on pride. And he talks about a proud look, a haughty look, which is another way of pride. And so that's where these are all attributes that fit and weave together to make up selfishness. So pride is a species of injustice. On the one hand, is nearly allied to ambition. On the other, it is not a term of so extensive and an import as either injustice or ambition. It sustains each of them a near relation, but is not identical with either. It is a kind of self-praise, self-worship, self-flattery, self-adulation, a spirit of self-consequence, of self-importance. It is a tendency to exalt. not merely one's own interests, but one person above others, and ultimately above God and above all other things. A proud being supremely regards himself, and he worships and can worship no one but himself. He does not, and remaining selfish, he cannot practically admit that there is anyone so good and worthy as himself. He aims at conferring supreme favor upon himself, and practically admits no claim of any other being in the universe to any good or interest that will interfere with his own. And this is where the teaching that I have come across in some institutions, we call it the name it and claim it crowd. Meaning, when they are praying, they believe they can command God. God, I want $1 million. And then they get upset when $1 million doesn't show up. God, I want a new car. New car doesn't show up. Then they get mad. And so this is the thing, is nothing can not go their way. And so that's why this teaching is very dangerous, because if we're not praying as God instructed us to pray, which is found in Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, I believe it's chapter 7, if I'm not wrong. And so nothing can interfere with these people. God, I claim healing. And then someone doesn't get healed because it's not God's will. So instead of seeking the will of God and seeking the kingdom, and all the things we need will be added to us, we think we can command. People will tell you, you have command over angels. The devil tried that with Jesus. And what did Jesus say? Do not tempt the Lord your God. The devil told him, throw yourself off. The angels will make sure you don't die. Jesus knew they wouldn't, but he responded correctly and said, do not tempt the Lord your God. So that's why a lot of the teachings that I've come across in moving in different denominations, different churches, different areas of the body of Christ, I have seen a lot of contrary teaching to the Word of God. Does that make me better? No. Because there is still, and God knows this, so much in my own life that needs to change. But for the grace of God, I will be one of those people. So there is no way to say anything but, I care for my brothers and sisters that teach that. I pray they would change. And with time and with the Holy Spirit, they will. Little bunny trail there. He can stoop to give preference to the interest, the reputation, the authority of no one. No, not even of God. Himself except outwardly and in appearance. His inward language is, who is Jehovah that I should bow down before him? It is impossible that a selfish soul should be humble. Sinners are presented in the Bible as proud, as flattering themselves in their own eyes. That's found in Isaiah 5:21. Pride is not a vice distinct from selfishness. but it is only a modification of selfishness. Selfishness is the root or the stock in which every sin inheres, and this is important to show. Selfishness has been scarcely regarded by many as a vice, much less as constituting all of vice. Consequently, when selfishness has been most apparent, it has been supposed and assumed that there might be, along with many forms of virtue. It is for this reason that I make this attempt to allow what are the essential elements of selfishness. It has been supposed that selfishness might exist in any heart, and it can, without implying every form of sin. That a man might be selfish, yet not proud? That's pretty impossible. In short, it has been overlooked that where selfishness is, there must be every form of sin. Some are just more developed than others in that moment. That where there is one form of selfishness manifested, it is virtually a breach of every commandment of God. We talk about that in James in some of the shorts we've been doing lately, and implies, in fact, the real existence of every possible form of sin and abomination in the heart. My object is fully to develop the great truth that where selfishness is, there must be, in a state either of development or of undevelopment, every form of sin that exists in earth or hell, and that all sin is a unit and consists of some form of selfishness, and that where this is, all sin virtually is and must be. Now, to say that, Finney is 100% accurate, because any sin that you look at, whether it be murder, theft, anger, jealousy, on and on down the line, it doesn't matter what it is. It's selfish is where it stems from. Think about jealousy or envy for a second. What is that? And we're probably either did it in the last video or we'll get to it in this one. But jealousy, envy, how is that selfish? Well, you look at what someone else has that you don't have, and then you want it. Plain and simple, that's selfishness, because it's something you don't have and you want. And so you're mad that they have it and you don't. Clearly, that's all about self and is selfishness. Believe it or not, the fact that we look around us and we hear things that this is probably one of the most selfish generations in human history. And to highlight that point, the divorce rate is higher than it has ever been. Why is that? People are more selfish than they've ever been. They're more godless than they've ever been in certain areas of the world. And that's a pretty scary thought, because if pride and selfishness go hand in hand, that's the reason that our divorce rates are so high. People are not willing these days to sacrifice self the way the Bible commands us to make a marriage work. People talk about 50-50. That's a load of garbage. It doesn't work that way. Each person has to give 100, and then it'll work. The only reason that pride as a form of selfishness does not appear in all sinners in the most disgusting forms, so there's varying degrees at times, is only this: that their constitutional temperament and providential circumstances are such as to give a more prominent development to some other attribute of selfishness. So that's why there's varying degrees. For some it's porn, for some it's weed, for some it's drinking, for some it's smoking, there's eating, there's all different kinds. It is important to remark that where any one form of unqualified sin exists, there selfishness must exist. And there, of course, every form of sin must exist, at least in an embryo stage, meaning you have the ability, you maybe just don't act it out. It's within you, and waiting only for circumstances to develop it. When therefore you see any form of sin, know assuredly that selfishness, the root, is there, and accept nothing else if selfishness continues than to see developed one after another every form of sin as the occasion shall present itself. And just to jump on that there a little bit, is that it's the victim bully mentality, right? Is that every bully's been a victim at some point. Every victim, if the opportunity arises, will be the bully. Because you look at situations, a kid is a bully at school. Why? Because they're a victim at home. You go to the workplace. Someone acts out in a bullying manner. Well, they're probably by their spouse or by their kids, they're getting bullied at home. And yes, parents get bullied by their kids. Especially these days when kids are taught that they are in control of the parents. Where do they learn those ideas? From the television, from the video games, and from school. Yes, school teaches them that. But what does it all boil down to? Selfish. Everyone wants their own way. It's like, I want my way, my way, my way, my way. That's probably how we sound. Even when we're praying sometimes. So, even the victim can be the bully. The potential is there. It's potential energy and kinetic energy. So when you're bullying, that's the kinetic. When you're being a victim, that's the potential. Right? It's in there. It just hasn't come out yet. Selfishness is a volcano. That's a good analogy. Sometimes it's smothered or held back because it has to be for a time until it must have a vent. The providence of God cannot but present occasions upon which its lava tides will burst forth and carry desolation before them. That all these forms of sin exist and has been known and admitted, but it does not appear to me that the philosophy of sin has been duly considered by many. Most people don't even think they're lost in sin. They don't even give it a second thought. It is important that we should get at the fundamental or generic form of sin, that form which includes and implies all others, or more properly, which constitutes the whole of sin. Such is selfishness. Let it be written with the point of a diamond and engraved in the rock forever. Jeremiah 17:1. That it may be known that where selfishness is, there every precept of the law is violated, and there is the whole of sin, its guilt and ill desert, and must depend upon the light with which the selfish mind is surrounded. But sin, the whole of sin, is there. Such is the very nature of selfishness that it only needs the proverbial occasions to be left without restraint and it will show itself to have embodied in embryo every form of iniquity. Alright, so the next part that we're going to look at here is something called enmity. That is spelled E-N-M-I-T-Y. And that simply means that you are, and I'm not saying you specifically, whoever's watching this, but in general, whoever is at enmity with God is an enemy of God. Someone who is at odds with or against God is what that means. So, let's get into enmity against God. And clearly, if you're an enemy of God, there's got to be a certain level of selfishness there. So, enmity is hatred, and hatred is rejection. So, hatred may exist either as a phenomenon of the sensibility, meaning emotional hatred, or as a state of attitude in the will, simply meaning you reject. Of course, I am now to speak of enmity of heart or will. It is selfishness viewed in its relations to God. That selfishness is enmity against God. From the Bible, the Apostle Paul expressly says that the carnal mind, meaning the fleshly mind, the worldly mind, is enmity against God. Romans 8:7. It is fully evident that the apostle, by the carnal mind, means obeying the propensities of or gratifying the desires. But this, as I have defined, it is selfishness. Selfishness is directly opposed to the will of God, as expressed in His law. That requires love. Selfishness is its opposite, and therefore enmity against the lawgiver. Selfishness is as hostile to God's government as it can possibly be. It is directly opposed to every law and principle and measure of His government. We see that in the world all around us. If it feels good, do it. If you want to do it, do it. Selfishness is opposition to God's existence. Opposition to a government is opposition to the will of the governor, which means you're against God. It is opposition to His existence in that capacity. It is and must be enmity against the existence of the ruler as such. Selfishness must be enmity against the existence of God's government, and as He does and must sustain the relation of sovereign ruler, selfishness must be enmity against His being. Selfishness will brook no restraint in respect to securing its end. There is nothing in the universe it will not sacrifice to self, and this is true, or it is not selfishness. If then God's happiness or government or being come into competition with it, they must be sacrificed, were it possible, for selfishness to affect it. But God is the uncompromising enemy of selfishness. It is the abominable thing His soul hates. He is more in the way of selfishness than all other beings. The opposition of selfishness to Him is and must be supreme and perfect. That selfishness is mortal enmity against God and is not left to conjecture, nor to a mere deduction or inference. God once took to Himself human nature and brought divine love into conflict with human selfishness. Men could not brook His presence upon the earth, and they rested not until they had murdered Him, meaning they couldn't deal with the truth of His Spirit, and so they killed Him. Enmity against anybody or thing besides God can be overcome more easily than against Him. all earthly enmities can be overcome with kindness and change of circumstances. But what kindness, what change of circumstance can change the human heart? Can overcome the selfishness or enmity to God that reigns there? Selfishness offers all manner and every possible degree of resistance to God. It disregards God's commands. It condemns His authority. It spurns His mercy. It outrages His feelings. It provokes His forbearance. And selfishness, in short, is the universal antagonist and adversary of God. It can no more be reconciled to His law that it can cease to be selfish. All right. Intemperance is our next attribute of selfishness. And so we'll get into what intemperance is, but basically it's just there's no self-control. So selfishness is self-indulgence, not sanctioned by the reason. It consists in the committal of the will to the indulgence of propensities. Of course, some one or more of the propensities must have taken the control of the will. Generally, there is some ruling passion or propensity to influence of which becomes overshadowing and overrules the will for its own gratification. Sometimes it is acquisitiveness or avarice, the love of gain, meaning greediness. And sometimes alimentiveness or epicureanism. Sometimes it's amativeness or sexual love, meaning lust. Sometimes, and this is a big word, philoprogenitiveness, or the love of our own children. So sometimes even our kids we can be selfish about and hold them as idols. Sometimes self-esteem or a feeling of confidence in self, and sometimes one and sometimes another of the great variety of propensities is so largely developed as to be the ruling tyrant that lords it over the will and over all the other propensities. It matters not which of the propensities or whether their united influence gains the mastery of the will. Whenever the will is subject to them, this is selfishness, and it is the carnal mind, meaning the mind without God. Intemperance consists in the undue or unlawful indulgence of any propensity, meaning thing that you do. It is therefore an essential element or attribute of selfishness. All selfishness is intemperance. Of course, it is an unlawful indulgence of the propensities. Intemperance has as many forms as there are constitutional and artificial appetites to gratify. A selfish mind cannot be temperate, meaning self-controlled. If one or more of the propensities is restrained, it is only restrained for the sake of the undue and unlawful indulgence of another. So meaning you might not do A, but you'll do B instead. Sometimes tendencies are intellectual and the bodily appetites are denied for the sake of gratifying the love of study. But this is no less intemperance and selfishness than the gratification of amativeness or alimentiveness. Selfishness is always and necessarily intemperate. Does not always or generally develop every form of intemperance in the outward life, but a spirit of self-indulgence must manifest itself in the intemperate gratification of some one or more of the propensities. Some develop self-indulgence most prominently in the form of intemperance in eating, others in sleeping, others in lounging and idleness or laziness. Others are gossipers, others love exercise and indulge that propensity, others study and impair health and induce derangement or seriously impair the nervous system. Indeed, there is no end to the forms which intemperance assumes, arising from the fact of the great number of propensities, natural and artificial, that in their turn seek and obtain indulgence. It should be always borne in mind that any form of self-indulgence, properly so called, is equally an instance of selfishness, and wholly inconsistent with any degree of virtue in the heart. But it may be asked, are we to have no regard whatsoever to our tastes, appetites, and propensities? I answer, we are to have no such regard to them as to make their gratification the goal for which we live, even for a moment. But there is a kind of regard to them which is lawful, and therefore a virtue. For example, I am on a journey for the service and glory of God. Two ways are before me. One affords nothing to regale the senses. The other conducts me through variegated scenery, sublime mountain passes, deep ravines, beside bubbling brooks and meandering rivulets, through beds of happiest flowers and woods of richest foliage, through aromatic groves and forests vocal with feathered songsters, meaning birds. The two paths are equal in distance and in all respects that have a bearing upon the business I have in hand. Now reason dictates and demands that I should take the path that is most agreeable and suggestive of useful thoughts. But this is not being governed by the propensities, but by the reason. It is its voice which I hear and to which I listen when I take the sunny path. The delights of this path are real good. As such, they are not to be despised or neglected. But if taking this path would embarrass and hinder the goal of my journey, I am not to sacrifice the greater public good for a lesser one of my own. I must not be guided by my feelings, but by my reason, an honest judgment in this and every case of duty. God has not given us propensities to be our master and to rule us, but to be our servants and to minister to our enjoyment when we obey the biddings of reason and of God. They are given to render duty and pleasant, and as a reward of virtue to make the ways of wisdom pleasurable. The propensities are not therefore to be despised, and nor is their annihilation to be desired, nor is it true that their gratification is always selfish. But when their gratification is sanctioned and demanded by the intellect, as in the case just supposed, and in myriads of other cases that occur, the gratification is not a sin, but a virtue. It is not selfishness, but benevolence or love. But let it be remembered that the indulgence must not be sought in obedience to the propensity itself, but in obedience to the law of reason and of God. When reason and the will of God are not only consulted, but even violated, it must be selfishness. Intemperance as a sin does not consist in the outward act of indulgence, but in the inward disposition. So it's the condition of your heart. A dyspeptic who can eat but just enough to sustain life may be an enormous glutton at heart. He may have a disposition, that is, he may not only desire, but he may be willing to eat all before him, but for the pain indulgence occasions him. But this is only the spirit of self-indulgence. He denies himself the amount of food he craves in order to gratify a stronger propensity, to wit, the dread of pain. So a man who is never intoxicated in his life may be guilty of the crime of drunkenness every day. He may be prevented from drinking to inebriation only by a regard to reputation or health. He's worried about what people think, or it might kill him. Or by an avaricious disposition. It is only because he is prevented by the greater power of some other propensity. If a man is in such a state of mind that he would indulge all his propensities without restraint, were it not that it is impossible on account of the indulgence of some being inconsistent with the indulgence of the others, he is just as guilty as if he did indulge them all. And this is where Jesus teaches us to fulfill the law. He says, don't be angry with your brother in your heart, because if you are, that is murder. Don't look at a woman with lust. That's adultery. So this is the thing, is that even though you don't indulge in those things, if you dwell on the thought process, then you're guilty of the action as well, because it's in your mind. It's the condition of your heart. And that's what God is most concerned with. So, as we said in James, if you look back at some of the shorts we've done, is that if you break one of them, you've broken all of them. But Jesus teaches the deeper roots so that if you take care of the anger, you'll never have need of the murder. So for example, if he has a disposition that is a will to accumulate property, he is avaricious in heart. He also has a strong tendency to luxury, to licentiousness and prodigality. The indulgence of these propensities is inconsistent with the indulgence of avarice. But for this contrariety, he would in his state of mind indulge them all. He wishes to do so, but it is impossible. Now he is really guilty of all those forms of vice, and just as blameworthy as if he had indulged in them. Intemperance as a crime is a state of mind. It is the attitude of the will. It is an attribute of selfishness, and it consists in the choice or disposition to gratify the propensities, regardless of the law of love. This is intemperance, and so far as the mind is considered, it is the whole of it. Now, inasmuch as the will is committed to self-indulgence, and nothing but the contrariety there is between the propensities prevents the unlimited indulgence of them all, it follows that every selfish person, or in other words, every sinner, is chargeable in the sight of God with every species of intemperance, actual or conceivable. His lusts have the rein. They conduct him whithersoever they list. He has sold himself to self-indulgence. If there is any form of self-indulgence that is not actually developed in him, no thanks to him, the providence of God has restrained the outward indulgence, while there has been in him a readiness to perpetrate any sin and every sin, from which he has not deterred by some overpowering fear of consequences. Alright, so we're coming down to it, it looks like here. It's long, but we're at the last section here. And so we're talking about total moral depravity. And it is implied in selfishness as one of its attributes. By this, we intend that every selfish being is at every moment as wicked and as blameworthy as with his knowledge that he can be. So, let's get down to it here, because we're getting close to the hour already. And yeah, it's time to get through this last part here, even though it's long. And we'll wrap it up. I appreciate it if you guys have stuck around this long. Hopefully you've been learning. I know I have. And yeah, so let's get to it so that we can get her done. It is affirmed both by reason and revelation that there are degrees of guilt, that some are more guilty than others, and that the same individual may be more guilty at one time than at another. The same is true of virtue. One person may be more virtuous than another, when both are truly virtuous. And also, the same person may be more virtuous at one time than at another, although he may be virtuous at all times. And in other words, it is affirmed both by reason and revelation that there is such a thing as growth, both in virtue and in vice. It is matter of general belief also that the same individual with the same degree of light or knowledge is more or less praise or blameworthy as he shall do one thing or another, or in other words, as he shall pursue one course or another to accomplish the goal he has in view, or which is the same thing that the same individual with the same knowledge or light is more or less virtuous or vicious according to the course of outward life which he shall pursue. This I shall attempt to show is human prejudice and a serious and most injurious error. It is also generally held that two or more individuals have precisely the same degree of light or knowledge, and being both equally loving or selfish, may nevertheless differ in their degree of virtue or vice, according as they pursue different courses of outward conduct. This is also, I shall attempt to show, a fundamental error. We can arrive at the truth upon this subject only by clearly understanding how to measure moral obligation, and of course how to ascertain the degree of virtue and sin. The amount or degree of virtue or vice, or of praiseworthiness or blameworthiness, is and must be decided by reference to the degree of obligation. And here I would remind you that moral obligation is founded in the intrinsic value of the highest well-being of God and the universe, and that the conditions of the obligation are the possession of the powers of moral agency and light, or the knowledge of the goal to be chosen. Hence it follows that the obligation is to be measured by the mind's honest apprehension or judgment of the intrinsic value of the end to be chosen, that this and nothing else is the rule or standard by which the obligation and consequently the guilt of violating it is to be measured, and will appear if we consider that the obligation cannot be measured by the infinity of God apart from the knowledge of the infinite value of his interests. He is an infinite being, and his well-being must be of intrinsic value and of infinite value. But unless this be known to a moral agent, he cannot be under obligation to will it as an ultimate goal. If he knows it to be of value, he is bound to choose it for that reason, but the measure of his obligation must be just equal to the clearness of his apprehension of its intrinsic value. Besides, if the infinity of God were alone or without reference to the knowledge of the agent, the rule by which moral obligation is to be measured, it would follow that obligation is in all cases the same, and of course that the guilt of disobedience would also be in all cases the same. But this, as has been, contradicts both reason and revelation. Thus it appears that moral obligation and of course guilt cannot be measured by the infinity of God without reference to the knowledge of the agent. It cannot be measured by the infinity of his authority without reference to the knowledge of the agent for the same reasons as above, and it cannot be measured by the infinity of his moral excellence without reference both to the infinite value of his interests and of the knowledge of the agent, for his interests are to be chosen as a goal or an end, or for their own value, and without knowledge of their value there can be no obligation, and nor can obligation exceed knowledge. If again the infinite excellence of God were alone or without reference to the knowledge of the agent to be the rule by which moral obligation is to be measured, it would follow that guilt in all cases of disobedience is and must be equal. This we have seen cannot be. It cannot be measured by the intrinsic value of the good or well-being of God and the universe without reference to the knowledge of the agent for the same reason as above. And it cannot be measured by the particular course of life pursued by the agent, and this will appear if we consider that moral obligation has directly nothing to do with the outward life. It directly respects the ultimate intention only, and that decides the course of outward action or life. The guilt of any outward action cannot be decided by reference to the kind of action, without regard to the intention, so meaning the condition of your heart. For the moral character of the act must be found in the intention and not the outward act or life. This leads me to remark that the degree of moral obligation and of course the degree of guilt of disobedience cannot be properly estimated by reference to the nature of the intention without respect to the degree of the knowledge of the agent. Selfish intention is, as we have seen, a unit always the same, and if this were the standard by which the degree of guilt is to be measured, it would follow that it is always the same. Nor can obligation nor the degree of guilt be measured by the tendency of sin. All sin tends to infinite evil, to ruin the sinner, and from its contagious nature, to spread and ruin the universe. Nor can any finite mind know what the ultimate results of any sin might be, nor to what particular evil it may tend. As all sin tends to universal and eternal evil, if this were the criterion by which the guilt is to be estimated, all sin would be equally guilty, which cannot be. Actually, it is. Again, that the guilt of sin cannot be measured by the tendency of sin is manifest from the fact that the moral obligation is founded in the tendency of action or intention, but in the intrinsic value of the goal to be intended. Estimating moral obligation or measuring sin or holiness by the mere tendency of actions is the utilitarian philosophy, which we have shown to be false. A moral obligation respects the choice of an end, and is founded upon the intrinsic value of the end, and is not so much as conditionated upon the tendency of the ultimate choice to secure its end, and therefore tendency can never be the rule by which obligation can be measured, nor, of course, the rule by which guilt can be estimated. Nor can moral obligation be estimated by the results of a moral action or course of action. Moral obligation respects intention and respects results no further than they were intended. Much good may result as from the death of Christ without any virtue in Judas, but with much guilt. So much evil may result as from the creation of the world without guilt in the Creator, but with great virtue. If moral obligation is not founded or conditionated on results, it follows that guilt cannot be duly estimated by results without reference to knowledge and intention. What has been said has, I trusted, rendered it evident that moral obligation is to be measured by the mind's honest apprehension or judgment of the intrinsic value of the goal to be chosen, to wit, the highest well-being of God and the universe. It should be distinctly understood that selfishness involves the rejection of the interests of God and of the universe for the sake of one's own interests. It refuses to will good, but upon condition that it belongs to self. It spurns God's interests and those of the universe and seeks only self-interest as an ultimate end. It must follow then that the selfish man's guilt is just equal to his knowledge of the intrinsic value of those interests that he rejects. This is undeniably the doctrine of the Bible. Acts affords a plain instance. The apostle alludes to those past ages when the heathen nations had no written revelation from God, and remarks that those times of ignorance God winked at. Acts 17:30. This does not mean that God did not regard their conduct as criminal in any degree, but it does mean that he regarded it as a sin of far less aggravation than that which men would now commit if they turned away when God commanded them all to repent. True sin is never absolutely a light thing, but some sins incur small guilt when compared with the great guilt of other sins. This is implied in the text quoted above. To him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. James 4:17. This plainly implies that knowledge is indispensable to moral obligation, and even more than this is implied, namely that the guilt of any sinner is always equal to the amount of his knowledge on the subject. It always corresponds to the mind's perception of the value of the end which should have been chosen, but is rejected. If a man knows he ought in any given case to do good, and yet he does not do it, to him this is sin, the sin plainly lying in the fact of not doing good when he knew that he could do it, and being measured as to its guilt by the degree of that knowledge. Jesus said unto them, If you were blind, you should have no sin. But now you say, We see, and therefore your sin remains. John 9:41. Here Christ asserts that men without knowledge would be without sin, and that men who have knowledge, and sin notwithstanding, are held guilty. This plainly affirms that the presence of light or knowledge is requisite to the existence of sin, and obviously implies that the amount of knowledge possessed is the measure of the guilt of sin. It is remarkable that the Bible everywhere assumes first truths. It does not stop to prove them or even assert them, but seems to assume that everyone knows and will admit them. As I have been recently writing on moral government and studying the Bible as to its teachings, on this class of subjects I have been often struck with this remarkable fact. And that servant which knew his Lord's will, and prepared not himself, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. But he that did not know, and did commit things worthy of stripes, shall be beaten with few stripes. For unto whoever much is given, of him shall much be required. And to whom men have committed much, of him they will ask the more. Luke 12:47 and 48. Here we have the doctrine laid down and the truth assumed that men shall be punished according to knowledge. To whom much light is given, of him shall much obedience be required. This is precisely the principle that God requires of men according to the light that they have. Selfishness is the rejection of all obligation. It is the violation of all obligation. The sin of selfishness is then complete. That is, the guilt of the selfishness is as great as with its present light it can be. What can make it greater? With present light, can the course that it takes to realize its goal mitigate its guilt? No. For whatever course it takes, it is for a selfish reason, and therefore it can in no wise lessen the guilt of the intention. Can the course it takes to realize its goal without more light increase the guilt of the sin? No, for the sin lies exclusively in having the selfish intention, the condition of your heart. And the guilt can be measured only by the degree of illumination or knowledge under which the intention is formed and maintained. The intention necessitates the use of the means, which is how you get there, the tools. And whatever tools the selfish person uses, it is for one and the same reason, to gratify himself. As I said in a former lecture, if the selfish man were to preach the gospel, it would be only because, upon the whole, it was most pleasing or gratifying to himself, probably the feeling he gets from doing it, and not all for the sake of the good of being as the goal. If he should become a pirate, it would be for exactly the same reason, to wit, that this course is upon the whole most pleasing or gratifying to himself, and not at all for the reason that course is evil in itself. Whichever course he takes it for precisely the same ultimate reason, and with the same degree of light. It must involve the same degree of guilt. If light increases, his guilt must increase, but not otherwise, because the more light you have, the more dirt you can see. The proposition is that every selfish being is at every moment as blameworthy as with his present knowledge he can be. Which of these courses may tend ultimately to the most evil, no finite being can say, nor which shall result in the greatest evil. Guilt is not to be measured by unknown tendencies or results, but belongs to the intention, and its degree is to be measured alone by the mind's apprehension of the reason of the obligation violated, namely the intrinsic value of the good of God and the universe, which selfishness rejects. Now it should be remembered that whichever course the sinner takes to realize his goal, it is the end at which he aims. He intends the end. If he becomes a preacher of the gospel for a selfish reason, he has no right regard to the good of being. If he regards it at all, it is only as a means of his own good. So if he becomes a pirate, it is not for malice or a disposition to do evil for its own sake, but only to gratify himself. If he has any regard at all to the evil he may do it, it is only to gratify himself that he regards it. Whether therefore he preach or pray or rob and plunder upon the high seas, he does it only for one goal, and that is for precisely the same ultimate reason. And of course, his sinfulness is complete in the sense that it can be varied only by varying light. This, I know, is contrary to common opinion, but it is the truth and must be known. And it is of the highest importance that these fundamental truths of morality and of immorality should be held up to the minds of all. Should the sinner abstain from any course of vice, because it is wicked, it cannot be because he is loving. For this would contradict the supposition that he is selfish or that he is a sinner. If in consideration that an act or course is wicked, he abstains from it, it must be for a selfish reason. It may be in obedience to phrenological conscientiousness, or it may be from fear of hell, or of disgrace, or from remorse. At all events, it cannot but be for some selfish reason. Total moral depravity is an attribute of selfishness in the sense that every selfish person is at all times just as wicked and blameworthy as with his present light that he can be. Alright, so if these last two sermons haven't really solidified poor in spirit as a necessity, I'm not really sure what will, because in these last two sermons we've really gone deep as to how deep selfishness can be, because even people who believe that they are godly people are deeply selfish people. Born in sin, it can't be any other way. And so I really encourage you guys is that poor in spirit, recognizing the need of a savior, humbling yourself, resigning yourself to God, mourning after him, hungering and thirsting after God. These things are so super important simply because we are born in sin, and sin is selfishness. And pride is so sneaky that it slides its way in every time. So I just want to encourage y'all. These are the attributes of selfishness as laid out by Charles Finney. There's probably more that we didn't get into, and hopefully y'all can learn about those. And going forward, we're going to be shifting gears next week, and don't forget to check it out and see which direction we decide to go. And there's more real good stuff coming down the line from Hope Rekindled. I am working on being able to do live sessions, live hangouts with y'all. Hopefully y'all will jump in on the chats. Let me know you're there. Come watch. Come hang out with me. And we'll study the Word of God together. I'm working on it. I'm not sure exactly when the live stuff will take place. But once I get there, we're going to take it off. And yeah, don't forget to check it out back next week for another episode of the Hangout Sessions. As always, was a good cup tonight. Hope y'all had a good time, and we'll see you then.
Something deep inside, it keeps me